What does a war sound like decades after the last shot is fired? It isn't always silent. Sometimes it's the slow drip of oil from a steel hull 2 miles beneath the waves. Sometimes it's the crackle of a Geiger counter over soil that looks perfectly fine. Sometimes it's the strange quiet of a forest where certain birds no longer sing. The Second World War was a global event that reshaped nations and redrew maps. We know that story, but it was also a global industrial event. It changed how we make things, how we grow food, and how we use the planet itself. And it left behind wounds, not just in our cities and our memories, but in the very fabric of the environment. These are scars that don't heal cleanly. They are problems that were buried, submerged, or simply forgotten in the rush to rebuild. They are still with us, ticking away like old clocks. What happens when we finally start to look at these hidden legacies? What happens when the ghosts of that war start to bleed into our present? Well, number 15, what happens when steel tombs start to bleed? Thousands of ships went down during the war. Tankers, warships, cargo vessels. They settled on the seabed in the cold and the dark. For decades, they were just silent monuments slowly being claimed by the sea. But they are not just steel. They are containers. And inside, they hold a toxic brew from a different era. The biggest threat is the fuel. Many of these ships carried millions of gallons of thick, heavy bunker oil. It's a substance more like tar than the gasoline we use today. And the sea is patient. It eats steel. Saltwater corrosion is a slow, relentless process. Over 70 years, it thins the metal plates. It weakens the rivets, and eventually the tanks begin to fail. We see this happening right now. The USS Arizona in Pearl Harbor is a famous example. It still leaks a few quarts of oil every day, a phenomenon sometimes called the Black Tears of the Arizona. That's from a ship in a shallow, protected harbor. Now imagine thousands of others scattered across the world's oceans, many in deep, turbulent water. Researchers estimate that the wrecks from this period contain between 2.5 and 20 million tons of oil. That's a massive potential spill, not in one place, but spread across the globe. The German cruiser Blucher, sunk in a Norwegian fjord in 1940, held around 2,000 tons of oil. In 1994, a major operation was undertaken to pump out over 1,000 tons of that oil because it had started to leak, threatening the local marine ecosystem. The operation was complex and expensive, a preview of what we face on a global scale. But it's not just oil. These ships were products of their time. They are filled with materials we now know are hazardous. Asbestos was used for insulation, and PCBs or polychlorinated biphenyls were used in electrical equipment. Lead paint coated their hulls. And then there's the cargo. Many ships were carrying munitions. Shells, bombs, and torpedoes filled their magazines. These contain heavy metals like lead and mercury, and explosive compounds like TNT and RDX. As the casings corrode, these chemicals leach into the surrounding water. A 2018 study published in the journal Marine Pollution Bulletin looked at the shipwreck V1302 John Mon off the Belgian coast. Researchers found high concentrations of heavy metals and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, PAHs, a component of oil, in the sediment around the wreck. They also found traces of explosives. The area immediately around the ship showed a clear toxic effect on the local marine life. The problem is one of time and scale. These are ticking time bombs, not necessarily because of the explosives, but because of the slow, inevitable chemical release. Dr. Trevor Gilbert, a marine chemist, has been warning about this for years. He points out that the rate of corrosion will likely accelerate. Many of these wrecks are reaching a critical point in their decay. What was a slow seep could become a catastrophic release. NOAA, the U.S. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, has a program to identify and assess the most threatening wrecks in U.S. waters. Their 2013 report identified 87 high-priority wrecks. One of them, the oil tanker SS Coimbra, sunk off the coast of New York in 1942, was found to be a substantial threat. In 2019, teams began removing oil from it, confirming the danger was real. But that's just one ship. There are thousands more Many we haven't even properly located. They are silent, deep, and forgotten. But they are not inert. They are slowly but surely bleeding their legacy into the oceans. How many of these potential underwater toxic sites do we not even know exist? What happens to a delicate marine ecosystem when a massive slug of 70-year-old bunker fuel is suddenly released from a collapsing hull? Are we prepared for the cost and complexity of making thousands of deep sea wrecks safe? And what happens when we discover that the most dangerous thing on a sunken ship wasn't its weapons, but the very materials used to build it? Number 14 was victory grown with poison. In the early 1940s, the world was focused on two fronts, the battlefield and the farm field. Feeding soldiers and civilians was a critical part of the war effort. This pressure for more food, grown faster, on less land, with less labor, created a perfect storm for a chemical revolution. And at the heart of that revolution was a compound called dichloroethylphenyl trichloroethane. We know it as DDT. The DDT wasn't new. It was first synthesized in 1874, but its power as an insecticide was discovered in 1939 by a Swiss chemist named Paul Hermann Muller. The timing was perfect. The substance was cheap to produce, incredibly effective at killing a wide range of insects, and it lasted for a long time wherever it was sprayed. During the war, it was hailed as a miracle. It was used to control lice, which spread typhus, and mosquitoes, which spread malaria. Dusting soldiers and civilians with DDT powder became a common public health measure, credited with saving countless lives from disease. The success was so profound that DDT quickly moved from public health to agriculture. The thinking was simple: if it can kill insects that harm humans, it can kill insects that harm crops. After the war ended, the chemical industry, which had geared up for massive production, turned its focus to the domestic market. Here, DDT was sprayed on everything. It was sprayed on forests to kill spruce budworm, on suburbs to kill mosquitoes, and most of all, on farms. It was a key ingredient in what became known as the Green Revolution, a period of massively increased agricultural yields. For a time, it seemed like a perfect solution. Crop losses plummeted, food became more abundant. Paul Muller even won the Nobel Prize in 1948 for his discovery. But the miracle had a dark side. The very thing that made DDT so effective, its persistence, also made it an environmental nightmare. It doesn't break down easily. When it was sprayed on a field, it didn't just stay there. Rain washed it into streams and rivers. It seeped into the groundwater. It clung to soil particles, and it began to move up the food chain. This process is called biomagnification. Small organisms like plankton would absorb a little bit of DDT from the water. Small fish would eat lots of plankton, concentrating the DDT in their bodies. Larger fish would eat the smaller fish, concentrating it even more. And at the top of the food chain were birds of prey like bald eagles, ospreys, and peregrine falcons. They accumulated massive doses of DDT in their fatty tissues. The effect was not immediate death, it was more subtle. The DDT interfered with the bird's ability to process calcium. This meant the eggshells they produced were thin and brittle. When the mother bird sat on the eggs to incubate them, they would break. Entire generations of these magnificent birds were wiped out. These populations crashed. The connection wasn't made for years. It took the work of a biologist and writer named Rachel Carson. In her 1962 book, Silent Spring, she meticulously documented the environmental impact of DDT and other pesticides. She pulled together research from across the country and presented it in a way the public could understand. She described a future spring that was silent because the birds were gone. The book was a sensation and sparked the modern environmental movement. It led to a nationwide ban on the agricultural use of DDT in the United States in 1972, but the chemical is still with us. It's found in the soil of old farms. It's in the sediment at the bottom of lakes. And because it was used so widely across the globe, it's even found in the fat of penguins in Antarctica and in polar bears in the Arctic, thousands of miles from where it was ever sprayed. The drive for victory and post-war abundance left us with a chemical legacy that will persist in the global ecosystem for generations to come. How much DDT is still locked away in soil and sediment, waiting to be disturbed and re-enter the food chain? Did the short-term benefit of increased crop yields justify the decades of ecological damage that followed? Are we currently using other miracle chemicals in our modern lives that will have similarly devastating, unforeseen consequences 50 years from now? And what other forgotten compounds developed in the rush of the war are still circulating in our environment, their effects completely unknown to us? Number 13, did we pave over paradise to build a fortress? War is a logistical beast. It's not just about battles, it's about moving massive numbers of people and mountains of material from one place to another quickly. The Second World War was fought on a scale never seen before, and it required a whole new level of infrastructure. Airfields, highways, ports, and military bases were built at a frantic pace, often in places that were previously untouched wilderness. This construction boom didn't stop when the war ended. The methods, machines, and mindset carried over into the post-war era, fundamentally changing our relationship with the landscape. One of the most dramatic examples is the Alaska Highway. Before 1942, a land route to Alaska was just a vague idea. But after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the perceived threat to the territory became very real. In a stunning feat of engineering, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers pushed a 1,500-mile road through brutal subarctic wilderness in just 8 months. They built it to move troops and supplies. They didn't have time for environmental impact studies, they just built. The highway cut through pristine forests, crossed hundreds of rivers, and sliced through animal migration routes. Fundamentally fragmented the ecosystem. It also opened up the vast interior of the North to development, mining, and oil exploration on a scale that would have been unimaginable before. This story was repeated all over the world. In the Pacific, tiny, idyllic islands were transformed into massive military installations. On islands like Tinian or Guam, engineers flattened entire landscapes to build bomber runways, some of the longest in the world at the time. They dredged coral reefs to create deep water harbors for warships. They built roads, barracks, and fuel depots. This construction fundamentally altered the hydrology of the islands, leading to soil erosion and runoff that smothered the remaining reefs. The military bases themselves became permanent fixtures. Many of these installations, built for a temporary conflict, are still in operation today, continuing their environmental footprint. In Europe, the need to move armies and rebuild shattered cities led to the creation of modern highway systems. The German Autobahn, which had its origins before the war, became a model for high-speed, controlled access roads. After the war, the United States embarked on the Interstate Highway System, one of the largest public works projects in human history. The official justification laid out in the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 was national defense. The idea was to create a network of roads that could evacuate cities and move military convoys in case of a national emergency. But these highways had a massive environmental cost. They paved over millions of acres of farmland and natural habitat. They created impassable barriers for wildlife, isolating populations and reducing genetic diversity. They increased our reliance on the automobile, leading to decades of air pollution. The concrete veins we built to connect and protect our country also divided and damaged its natural ecosystems. The war taught us how to alter the landscape on an industrial scale. It gave us the earth-moving equipment, the engineering know-how, and the national will to undertake projects that would have seemed impossible a generation earlier. We built for security and for progress, but in doing so we created a permanent set of scars on the land, scars that continue to shape and often limit the natural world around us. How do you even begin to measure the total environmental cost of a single highway that has been in use for over 70 years? What is the cumulative impact of thousands of military bases, each a small industrial city, on the global environment? Could we have rebuilt and developed our nations after the war in a way that didn't create such a profound and lasting division between human infrastructure and natural habitats? And are the transportation systems we rely on today a legacy of progress or a permanent trap that prevents us from living more sustainably? Number 12, what does a bomb do to a coral reef? The war in the Pacific was a war of islands, and many of those islands were surrounded by some of the most vibrant and delicate ecosystems on Earth, coral reefs. These reefs were not just beautiful, they were the foundation of life for the islands. They were nurseries for fish, barriers against storm surges, and the source of food for local populations. But in the context of a global conflict, they were simply obstacles. They were obstacles to landing craft, obstacles to deep water ports, and obstacles to be cleared for strategic advantage. The destruction was systematic and widespread. In places like Palau, Palaliu, or the Marshall Islands, reefs were deliberately dynamited. Channels were blasted through them to allow ships to reach the shore. Harbors were dredged, and the resulting sediment was dumped onto nearby coral gardens, smothering them in silt. And then there was the direct impact of combat. Naval bombardments meant to soften up island defenses, rain down shells on the reefs. Aerial bombing campaigns did the same. A single 500-pound bomb could create a crater dozens of feet wide, instantly obliterating centuries of coral growth. The ships that were sunk during these battles also became part of the problem. As we've discussed, they leak oil and other toxins. But their physical presence is also an issue. A large warship settling on a reef can crush a huge area of coral. And as they break apart over the decades, their heavy steel components shift and scrape, causing continued physical damage. The atoll of Bikini, part of the Marshall Islands, is perhaps the most extreme example of this destruction, though most of it came in the years immediately following the war. It was chosen as a site for atomic bomb testing precisely because of its remoteness. Between 1946 and 1958, the United States detonated 23 nuclear devices at Bikini Atoll. The blasts vaporized entire islands and carved massive craters in the lagoon floor. One test, Castle Bravo, was 1,000 times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. It gouged a crater over a mile wide and 250 feet deep. The heat and shock waves annihilated the surrounding reef ecosystems. Even today, the atoll is a strange mix of devastation and resilience. Some coral species have begun to return, but the ecosystem is profoundly changed. A 2008 study led by scientists from the Chancellery of the Prince Albert II of Monaco Foundation found that dozens of coral species appeared to be locally extinct at Bikini. The large craters from the bombs have altered the water circulation patterns in the lagoon, which may be inhibiting a full recovery. But the damage wasn't limited to these high-profile test sites. Simple, everyday military activity took a toll. Anchors from large ships dragged across the seabed could destroy huge swaths of coral. The construction of causeways and airfields led to runoff and sedimentation that choked nearby reefs. The introduction of new species from the ballast water of ships could disrupt the delicate ecological balance. A study published in the Marine Pollution Bulletin in 2001 examined the long-term impacts of the war on the reefs of Guam. It found that areas that had been heavily impacted by dredging and construction during the 1940s still had lower coral cover and diversity than less disturbed areas. The scars are still visible more than half a century later. The coral reef is a slow-growing, intricate community. The war treated it with brute force and impatience, leaving behind a legacy of rubble and degraded ecosystems that may take centuries, if not millennia, to fully recover. How many square miles of coral reef were permanently lost due to wartime activities, and what effect did that loss have on coastal erosion and fish populations in the decades that followed? Can a reef that was destroyed by a bomb ever truly recover to its original state of biodiversity? What toxic materials are still embedded in the new reefs that have grown on top of sunken warships and planes? In our modern world, are we still treating these vital ecosystems as obstacles to be overcome rather than as irreplaceable natural treasures? Number 11, where did all the forests go? A war machine is built of wood. It's a fact that's easy to forget in an age of steel and composites, but in the 1940s, wood was a critical strategic material. It was used for almost everything. It formed the decks of battleships and aircraft carriers. It was used to build barracks, bridges, and railroad ties. The famous Mosquito bomber, one of the fastest planes of the war, was built almost entirely of plywood, earning it the nickname the Wooden Wonder. Crates to ship ammunition, rifles, and food were made of wood. Even the stocks of the rifles themselves were wood. The demand was insatiable, and this demand led to deforestation on a massive scale in places you might not expect. In the United Kingdom, which had already lost most of its ancient forests over the centuries, the situation was dire. Before the war, Britain imported 96% of its timber. With shipping lanes under constant threat, this was no longer sustainable. a massive domestic felling operation began. The Forestry Commission was tasked with identifying and harvesting any available timber. Ancient woodlands, country estates, and public parks were clear-cut. Areas that had been forested for 1,000 years were leveled in a matter of months. By the end of the war, Britain had sacrificed a huge portion of its remaining forest cover to the war effort. After the war, there was a major push to reforest, but the approach was industrial. Instead of replanting the native deciduous trees like oak and ash, the government prioritized fast-growing, non-native conifers like Sitka spruce. These trees grew in dense, uniform rows. They created timber, but they did not recreate the complex, biodiverse ecosystem of a native woodland. The soil chemistry changed, the undergrowth that supported insects and birds disappeared, the forests that were lost never truly came back. The United States faced a similar, though less desperate situation. The demand for wood skyrocketed. The Pacific Northwest, with its vast stands of old-growth Douglas fir, became a major source of timber. Logging operations, which were already extensive, went into overdrive. The need for Sitka spruce, prized for its strength-to-weight ratio in aircraft construction, was particularly high. Loggers pushed deeper into pristine wilderness areas. The war effort suspended many of the nascent conservation efforts and regulations that were just beginning to take shape. The writer and conservationist Aldo Leopold, working for the Forest Service at the time, lamented the pressure to cut in sensitive areas. The scale of the logging was immense, and it contributed to a long-term pattern of deforestation and habitat loss that continued long after the war was over. It wasn't just about cutting down trees, it was also about burning them. The firebombing campaigns against cities in Europe and Japan had an obvious human cost, but they also had an environmental one. These fires didn't just consume buildings, they destroyed urban green spaces. The parks, tree-lined avenues, and gardens that made cities livable were incinerated. In the countryside, battles could spark massive forest fires. A stray artillery shell or a crashed plane could ignite a blaze that would burn for days, destroying thousands of acres of forest. This was particularly true in the heavily forested areas of the Eastern Front and in the mountains of Italy. These fires caused immense soil erosion. With the trees and undergrowth gone, heavy rains would wash the topsoil into rivers, clogging them with sediment and destroying aquatic habitats. The war demanded a sacrifice of natural resources, and the world's forests paid a heavy price, leaving behind a legacy of simplified, less resilient ecosystems and barren, eroded landscapes. How many species lost their habitats permanently due to the clear cutting of ancient woodlands for the war effort? What was the long-term carbon cost of both the deforestation and the massive forest fires ignited by combat? Did the post-war shift to monoculture tree plantations create a new set of ecological problems that we are only now beginning to understand? And if we were faced with a similar global crisis today, would we once again sacrifice our last remaining old-growth forests for short-term security? Number 10, who were the uninvited travelers? War moves more than just soldiers and supplies. It moves entire ecosystems. Every ship, every plane, every crate is a potential vessel for a stowaway. Seeds, insects, reptiles, and microbes can travel across oceans and continents, hidden in the bilge water of a ship, the tread of a Jeep tire, or a shipment of food. The Second World War, with its unprecedented global movement of people and materials, triggered a massive and often unintentional wave of biological invasions. And some of these uninvited travelers have had catastrophic environmental consequences. The most infamous example is the brown tree snake on the island of Guam. Guam was a major strategic hub in the Pacific. It saw intense fighting and then became a massive base for military operations. Sometime in the late 1940s or early 1950s, it's believed that one or more brown tree snakes native to Australia and New Guinea hitched a ride to Guam, likely on a military cargo ship. On Guam, the snake found a paradise. There were no natural predators to keep it in check, and there was an abundance of food, the island's native birds, which had evolved over millions of years without the threat of a climbing, nocturnal snake predator. The result was an ecological disaster. The brown tree snake population exploded. They ate their way through the island's bird species. 10 of the 12 native forest bird species on Guam are now extinct in the wild. The island's forests are eerily quiet. The ecological ripple effects are still being studied. A 2017 study from the University of Washington found that the loss of birds, which used to disperse seeds, has dramatically reduced the regeneration of new trees in Guam's forests. The snake didn't just kill the birds, It is slowly killing the forest itself. This was not an isolated incident. The war created countless new pathways for invasive species. In Europe, a plant called the Japanese knotweed, originally brought over as an ornamental plant in the 19th century, spread rapidly on bomb sites. Its tough, resilient root system was able to thrive in the disturbed, rubble-filled ground where native plants struggled. It is now a major invasive pest in the UK and North America, capable of damaging building foundations and outcompeting native flora. In the United States, the movement of military equipment may have helped spread diseases like Dutch elm disease, which devastated the American elm, a classic feature of towns and cities across the country. The fungus that causes the disease is native to Asia and was spread by bark beetles, which could easily have been transported in untreated wood used for crates or pallets. The water in a ship's ballast tanks is another major vector. Ships take on water in one port to maintain stability, and then discharge it in another, releasing a soup of foreign organisms. The sheer volume of shipping during the war meant that countless marine species were transported to new environments. While it's hard to trace a specific introduction back to a single wartime voyage, the period saw a dramatic increase in this global mixing of marine life. This has led to problems like the invasion of the European green crab in North America and the comb jelly in the Black Sea, both of which have caused massive damage to local fisheries and ecosystems. The war tore down geographical barriers, not just for armies, but for the natural world as well. It set in motion a series of biological invasions that are still unfolding today, a permanent scrambling of the planet's ecosystems. How many of the invasive species we struggle with today got their foothold because of wartime transport? What unknown microbes or fungi were spread around the world with subtle but significant impacts on soil and plant health? Is it possible that the next brown tree snake is already establishing itself in a new environment, its devastating impact not yet apparent? And in an age of global trade that dwarfs even the logistics of the Second World War, have we learned anything about preventing these biological invasions, or have we just accelerated the problem? Number 9, is there a zone rouge we never talked about? After the First World War, a large area of northeastern France was deemed so devastated, so polluted, with unexploded shells, chemical weapons, and human remains that it was declared uninhabitable. They called it the Zone Rouge, the Red Zone. It was a permanent scar on the landscape. The Second World War had its own version of this, but it was different. It wasn't one single contiguous zone. It was a scattered patchwork of poisoned ground, thousands of sites all over the world where the fighting was fiercest. These are battlefields that have, on the surface, returned to nature. Forests have regrown, fields are green again. But beneath the surface, the legacy of the conflict remains. Consider the ground around a heavily shelled area. For every shell that exploded, several didn't. Like, these are the unexploded ordnance, or UXO, that we will discuss later. But even the ones that did explode left something behind. A modern artillery shell is a steel casing filled with a high explosive, like TNT. When it detonates, it shatters the casing into fragments and releases a blast wave. But the chemical reaction is not perfectly efficient. As residues of the explosive compounds, along with heavy metals from the casing and the fuse, like lead, mercury, and cadmium, are blasted into the surrounding soil. Now, multiply that by millions. In places like the Hurtgen Forest on the German-Belgian border, the site of a brutal, months-long battle in 1944 to 45, the soil is still saturated with these materials. A 2012 study by researchers at Johannes Gutenberg University of Mainz examined the forest floor in the area. They found that even decades after the war, the soil had elevated levels of heavy metals. They also found that the growth of beech trees in the most heavily fought over areas was stunted. The trees were struggling to survive in the contaminated soil. The physical landscape was also profoundly altered. The sheer number of craters from bombs and shells changed the topography and hydrology of entire regions. In many places, these craters have since filled with water, creating hundreds of thousands of small, unnatural ponds. And ecologists have studied these ponds and found they can become unique habitats for amphibians and insects. but they can also be toxic traps. The water can leach chemicals from the soil, and any unexploded ordnance at the bottom of the pond poses a constant threat. The practice of trench warfare, though less extensive than in the First World War, also left its mark. The digging of trenches, foxholes, and gun emplacements churned up the soil, mixing layers and disrupting the natural soil structure. In the years after the war, these disturbed areas were often the first to be colonized by aggressive, non-native plant species, altering the local ecology. In the vast expanses of the Eastern Front, the scale of the destruction was almost unimaginable. The scorched earth tactics employed by retreating armies involved deliberately destroying anything that might be useful to the enemy. This meant burning crops, leveling villages, and poisoning wells. The environmental impact of these actions was devastating and long-lasting. The burning of vast areas of farmland and forest released huge amounts of carbon into the atmosphere and led to massive soil erosion. The deliberate contamination of water sources had an immediate impact on human populations, but also on wildlife. The legacy of these battlefields is a complex one. It's a mosaic of chemical contamination, physical alteration, and ecological disruption. Unlike a factory site, which can be identified and remediated, a battlefield can cover thousands of square miles. The pollution is diffuse, spread across forests and fields. It's a scar that has been covered over by a thin layer of green, but it has never truly healed. How do you clean up a battlefield that is the size of a small country? What are the long-term health effects on wildlife and on humans living on or near these contaminated lands? Are the new ecosystems that have formed in bomb craters and on old trench lines a sign of nature's resilience, or are they toxic mirages? And what forgotten chemical and metallic residues are still slowly working their way through the soil and into the water table, their journey from the battlefields of the 1940s not yet over. Number 8, what was the price of our synthetic salvation? The Second World War was a war of resources, and one of the most critical was rubber. Rubber was essential for tires for every truck, jeep, and airplane. It was needed for hoses, gaskets, and boots. Before the war, over 90% of the world's natural rubber came from plantations in Southeast Asia. In 1942, these territories were rapidly captured, and the Allied powers were cut off from their primary supply. This created a crisis. The solution was a massive government-funded crash program to create a synthetic rubber industry from scratch. Chemists had been experimenting with synthetic polymers for years, but the war turned this research into an industrial imperative. Factories were built at an incredible speed. By 1944, the U.S. synthetic rubber industry was producing twice the amount of rubber that the country had consumed before the war. It was a remarkable technological achievement that was critical to the war effort, but it came with a hidden environmental price tag. The production of synthetic rubber and other synthetic materials like nylon, which replace silk for parachutes and plastics, requires a complex chemical process that uses petroleum as a feedstock. These processes generate a huge amount of toxic waste. The early plants were built quickly with little thought for environmental controls. Waste products, including carcinogenic chemicals like benzene and butadiene, were often dumped into nearby rivers or stored in unlined pits where they could leak into the groundwater. The air around these plants was filled with noxious fumes. These factories became epicenters of pollution that would persist for decades. Many of them would later become Superfund sites requiring billions of dollars for cleanup. The war also fundamentally changed our relationship with materials. It ushered in the age of disposability. The military needed packaging that was waterproof, lightweight, and cheap. Plastic was the perfect answer. It was used to protect equipment, food, and medical supplies. After the war, this new plastics mentality moved into the civilian world. The convenience of throwaway cups, wrappers, and containers was irresistible. The vast industrial capacity built to support the war was now used to churn out consumer goods. This was the beginning of the plastic pollution crisis we face today. The materials that were developed to win the war, to save lives by creating sterile medical equipment and preserving food, have now become a permanent contaminant, found in every ocean and even in our own bodies. The story of synthetic materials is a story of unintended consequences. The invention of nylon was a strategic triumph. The creation of a synthetic rubber industry was an industrial miracle, but these innovations left behind a legacy of polluted factory sites and a global culture of plastic dependency. The problem isn't just the waste we can see. The breakdown of these plastics creates microplastics, tiny particles that are now pervasive in our water, our air, and our food chain. A 2019 study commissioned by the World Wildlife Fund found that people could be ingesting the equivalent of a credit card's worth of plastic every week. The synthetic materials that helped secure victory have become a persistent, insidious part of our modern environment, a scar that is both global and microscopic. Did the scientists and engineers who developed these synthetic materials have any concept of their long-term environmental impact? How much of the toxic waste from wartime production is still sitting in the ground beneath old factory sites, unrecorded and unremediated? Is our modern plastic addiction an unavoidable consequence of the industrial path we chose during the war? And can we ever truly clean up a pollutant that has broken down into trillions of microscopic particles and spread to every corner of the planet? Number 7, are we still breathing the air of the war? The industrial output required to fight the Second World War was staggering. Factories that had been making cars were now making tanks. The shipyards were building vessels at a rate of 1 per day, and all of this production was powered by coal. Coal powered the factories, the trains that moved the supplies, and the ships that crossed the oceans. The sky over industrial cities like Pittsburgh, London, and the Ruhr Valley in Germany was thick with black smoke. This wasn't seen as pollution at the time, it was seen as progress. A smoking chimney meant jobs, it meant production, it meant we were winning the war. But that smoke was a toxic cocktail of sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, and particulate matter. It was the genesis of industrial-scale air pollution and acid rain. The sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides released from burning massive amounts of low-quality coal would rise into the atmosphere and react with water to form sulfuric and nitric acid. This acid would then fall back to Earth as acid rain, sometimes hundreds of miles from the source. It damaged forests by acidifying the soil and leaching out essential nutrients. It lowered the pH of lakes and streams, killing fish and other aquatic life. This phenomenon was not widely understood until the 1960s and 70s, but the chemical foundations for it were laid during the intense industrialization of the war years. The forests of Scandinavia were damaged by pollution from British industry, and the forests of Canada were damaged by pollution from the industrial heartland of the United States. The war effort treated the atmosphere as an infinite sewer, a place to dump the waste products of production without consequence. The problem wasn't just limited to the big industrial centers. The war also spurred the growth of the aviation industry. The development of massive bomber fleets and global air transport networks required huge amounts of high-octane aviation fuel. The combustion of this fuel released lead and other pollutants directly into the upper atmosphere. This was the beginning of a new kind of global pollution, one that wasn't tied to a specific factory but was spread across the sky. After the war, this aviation infrastructure became the foundation for our modern commercial airline industry, which continues to be a significant source of greenhouse gas emissions. The war also left a more direct legacy of airborne pollution. The firebombing of cities created immense plumes of smoke and toxic fumes. The combustion of buildings, which contained everything from asbestos to lead paint to early plastics, released a complex mix of carcinogens into the air. These pollutants would eventually settle back onto the ground, contaminating the soil and water of the rebuilding cities. And in the countryside, the widespread use of a technique called smudging, or creating smoke screens to hide troop movements or factories, also had an impact. This often involved burning oil or other chemical compounds to create a thick, persistent smoke. For the soldiers and civilians who had to breathe this air, the immediate health effects were severe. The long-term environmental effect was the deposition of yet another layer of petroleum-based pollutants onto the landscape. The war normalized the idea that the sky was a resource to be used, whether for transport or for waste disposal, and the consequences of that mindset are still present in the air we breathe today. How much did the massive, unregulated industrial emissions of the war years accelerate the process of climate change? What are the long-term health consequences for the generations of people who grew up in the heavily polluted air of post-war industrial cities? Are there still hotspots of soil contamination in urban areas that can be traced directly back to the fallout from wartime fires? And did the war create an industrial momentum that made it harder to shift to cleaner forms of energy in the decades that followed? Number 6, did we mine the earth bare to fuel the fight? A global war requires a global scale extraction of resources. The demand for metals, minerals, and fossil fuels during the Second World War was unlike anything the world had ever seen. The earth was mined, drilled, and stripped bare to provide the raw materials for the war machine. This intense period of extraction left deep and lasting scars on the planet, both at the sites of the mines themselves and in the global patterns of resource use that it established. The demand for iron and copper was immense. Iron was needed for steel, the backbone of every ship, tank, and gun. Copper was essential for wiring, shell casings, and communications equipment. Mines that had been operating at a steady pace for years suddenly went to 24-hour schedules. All new mines were open in remote areas with little regard for the environmental consequences. In the United States, the massive open-pit copper mines in places like Bingham Canyon, Utah, expanded dramatically. The amount of earth moved was measured in the hundreds of millions of tons. This created huge piles of waste rock known as tailings. These tailings are not just inert rock. They often contain heavy metals and sulfide minerals. When exposed to air and water, the sulfides can create sulfuric acid, a phenomenon known as acid mine drainage. This highly acidic, metal-laden water can leak from the tailings piles for centuries, contaminating rivers and groundwater for miles downstream. It wasn't just common metals. The war created a desperate search for rare and strategic minerals. Bauxite was needed for aluminum to build aircraft. Nickel was needed for armor plating. Manganese was essential for steel production. This led to a global scramble, with nations trying to secure their own supplies and deny them to the enemy. This often meant opening mines in ecologically sensitive areas. The environmental regulations that did exist were often waived in the name of national security. The legacy of these wartime mines can still be seen today. They are often abandoned sites with little to no remediation. The pits fill with toxic water, the tailings piles continue to leach pollutants, and the surrounding land is often a barren moonscape, unable to support plant life. The most profound impact, however, was on our consumption of fossil fuels. The war was the first truly mechanized conflict. It was powered by oil, the tanks, the ships, the airplanes. They all ran on petroleum. This led to a massive increase in oil exploration and drilling. The United States, which was the world's leading producer at the time, ramped up production to unprecedented levels. New oil fields were discovered and exploited in Texas, Oklahoma, and California. The war also spurred the development of new technologies for building long-distance pipelines and massive oil tankers, creating the global oil infrastructure we know today. This dependence on oil, cemented during the war, shaped the entire post-war economy. It fueled the growth of the suburbs, the rise of the automobile, and the creation of a globalized system of trade. It also locked us into a path of increasing carbon emissions and the eventual reality of climate change. The war didn't just burn through a lot of oil, it fundamentally reoriented our society around the consumption of it. The habits of extraction and consumption that were forged in the crucible of war became the habits of peacetime, with consequences that now affect the entire planet. How many abandoned wartime mines are still leaking toxic materials into our watersheds completely unmonitored? Did the wartime imperative to produce at all costs create a culture of environmental disregard in the mining industry that persists to this day? What would our world look like if the massive investment in oil infrastructure during the war had instead been directed toward other forms of energy? And are we still operating under a wartime mentality when it comes to resource extraction, taking what we need for the short term without fully considering the long-term cost? Number 5, what are the ticking chemical clocks at sea? At the end of the war, victorious nations were faced with a massive and dangerous disposal problem: what to do with the enemy's enormous stockpiles of chemical weapons. These were some of the most toxic substances ever created by humanity: mustard gas, phosgene, taboon, sarin. They were loaded into millions of shells, bombs, and containers. The sheer volume was overwhelming. The decision that was made, almost universally, was to dump them in the ocean. It seemed like a simple, effective solution. The ocean was vast, and the weapons would be out of sight, out of mind. From the late 1940s through the 1970s, hundreds of thousands of tons of chemical munitions were loaded onto ships, taken out to sea, and simply pushed overboard. Sometimes the weapons were dumped loose. Other times entire ships were scuttled, taking their deadly cargo with them to the seafloor. This happened all over the world. The Baltic Sea was a major dumping ground. It's estimated that at least 50,000 tons of chemical munitions were dumped there. The waters off the coast of Italy, near the port of Bari, were another site. In 1943, a U.S. ship carrying a secret cargo of mustard gas bombs was sunk during an air raid, releasing its contents into the harbor. After the war, more captured munitions were dumped in the same area. The waters around Japan, the United States, and the United Kingdom all have designated chemical weapons dump sites. One of the largest is known as Operation Chase Cut Holes and Sink 'em, where the U.S. military filled old cargo ships with nerve gas rockets and other obsolete weapons and deliberately sank them off the coast of Florida and other locations. For decades, this problem was largely forgotten, but like the conventional shipwrecks, the containers holding these chemical agents are made of steel, and steel corrodes in salt water. The munitions are now reaching the end of their lifespan. The casings are starting to rust through, and the chemical agents are beginning to leak out. This poses a terrifying risk. Fishermen in the Baltic Sea have been reporting for years that they are pulling up corroded shells in their nets. Sometimes they accidentally break them open, releasing mustard gas, which can cause severe, debilitating burns. In 2010, Polish fishermen hauled up a 2-ton lump of mustard gas that had solidified on the seabed. The ecological risk is even greater. As these agents leak, they can contaminate the surrounding sediment and water. A study published in the journal Marine Environmental Research in 2011 looked at the dump site near Bari, Italy. An area showed signs of DNA damage and other health problems consistent with exposure to mustard gas. The long-term effects of a slow, steady leak of these highly toxic compounds into the marine food web are largely unknown. And there is always the risk of a big burp, a sudden large-scale release of toxins if a scuttled ship finally collapses, or if a large pile of munitions is disturbed by an underwater landslide or human activity like the laying of a pipeline or a communications cable. Cleaning up these sites is extraordinarily difficult and dangerous. The weapons are often in deep water, covered in silt, and are highly unstable. Just locating all of them is a massive challenge. Many of the dumping operations were poorly documented, if at all. We have created toxic time bombs on the ocean floor, and their clocks are ticking. How many of these chemical weapons dump sites have we not yet found? What happens if a modern submarine accidentally collides with a scuttled ship full of nerve gas? Are the slow leaks from these munitions already causing subtle but widespread damage to marine ecosystems that we haven't detected? And is there any technology that can safely neutralize these weapons where they lie? Or are we simply forced to wait and see what happens when they finally fall apart? Number 4, why are farmers still plowing up bombs? The air campaigns of the Second World War were unprecedented in their scale. Millions of tons of bombs were dropped on cities, factories, and military targets across Europe and Asia. But not every bomb that was dropped exploded. For a variety of reasons, faulty fuses, soft ground, or just bad luck together, a significant percentage of them failed to detonate. Estimates vary, but it's generally thought that around 10% of bombs were duds. This means that hundreds of thousands of tons of unexploded ordnance, or UXO, were left buried in the ground, and they are still there. Every year across Europe, farmers plowing their fields turn up old bombs. Construction crews digging foundations for new buildings have to call in the bomb squad. This is not a rare occurrence. In Germany alone, it is estimated that over 2,000 tons of unexploded Allied and German munitions are discovered each year. They call it the Blindgänger, the dudes. These bombs are not harmless historical artifacts. They are live, unstable, and incredibly dangerous. The explosives inside them can become more sensitive and volatile over time as they degrade. The fuses, which are often complex mechanical and chemical devices, can corrode and become unstable. A slight jolt from a construction shovel or a plow can be enough to set them off. Major evacuations of entire city blocks are still a regular feature of life in cities like Berlin, London, and Warsaw. In 2017, a 1.8-ton British blockbuster bomb was found in Frankfurt, Germany, leading to the evacuation of over 60,000 people, the largest such evacuation in Germany since the war. The process of defusing or safely detonating these massive bombs is a highly specialized and perilous job. The environmental impact of this UXO is twofold. The first is the immediate danger and disruption. The presence of suspected UXO can halt construction projects, prevent the use of agricultural land, and pose a constant low-level threat to people living in formerly heavily bombed areas. The second is the chemical contamination. As the bomb casings corrode, the explosive compounds inside can leach into the soil and groundwater. TNT and its breakdown products are toxic and are considered probable human carcinogens by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. RDX, another common explosive, is also toxic and can cause seizures. This slow, steady release of chemicals from thousands of buried bombs represents a diffuse and largely unmeasured source of pollution. A 2015 report from the European Commission's Joint Research Center highlighted the risk of groundwater contamination from UXO, particularly in areas with a high density of buried bombs. The problem is not just on land. The coastal waters of Europe are also littered with UXO, bombs that missed their targets, as well as mines laid to disrupt shipping, now rest on the seabed. They pose a threat to fishermen, to the laying of underwater cables and pipelines, and to the construction of offshore wind farms. As with the land-based bombs, their casings are corroding, and they are leaking toxic chemicals into the marine environment. The sheer quantity of this unexploded ordnance is hard to comprehend. It is a hidden, deadly legacy scattered randomly across the continent. It forces us to deal with the most violent moments of the war, not as history, but as a clear and present danger. How many bombs are still out there, undiscovered, their locations completely unknown? What is the cumulative effect of thousands of corroding bombs slowly leaking carcinogenic chemicals into the aquifers that provide our drinking water? Is it even possible to find and remove all of this unexploded ordnance? Or is it a permanent feature of the landscape we must simply learn to live with? And what happens when the last generation of bomb disposal experts who have a direct lineage of knowledge back to the war is gone? Number 3, what is buried beneath the ground of progress? The industrial production that fueled the war effort took place at thousands of sites around the world. These were factories that made everything from ammunition and explosives to aircraft and chemicals. In the rush to produce, environmental safety was not a priority. The ground beneath these factories became a dumping ground for some of the most toxic and persistent chemicals imaginable. When the war ended, many of these factories were either closed down or converted to civilian use. The land was sold, redeveloped, and built upon. But the chemical waste didn't go away. It just sat there, silently migrating through the soil and into the groundwater. One of the most common and dangerous legacies is from the production of explosives, like TNT. The process of manufacturing TNT creates a toxic byproduct called red water, a wastewater stream contaminated with a variety of nitroaromatic compounds. During the war, this waste was often simply poured into unlined lagoons or pits with the assumption that it would just seep away. We now know that these compounds are highly toxic and persistent in the environment. They can contaminate groundwater for miles around the original site, making it unsafe to drink. Numerous former ordnance works in the United States, like the Joliet Army Ammunition Plant in Illinois or the Weldon Spring Ordnance Works in Missouri, have become massive Superfund sites requiring decades of cleanup at a cost of billions of dollars. It wasn't just explosives. The aviation industry used vast quantities of powerful solvents to degrease metal parts. These chemicals like trichloroethylene TCE and tetrachloroethylene PCE were used to clean everything from engine components to aircraft fuselages. These solvents are dense, heavier than water, and highly mobile in groundwater. A small spill of TCE can contaminate millions of gallons of drinking water. And they were not spilled in small amounts. It was common practice to simply dump used solvents onto the ground out the back door of a workshop. This happened at thousands of military airfields and aircraft factories. As a result, TCE contamination is one of the most common groundwater problems at former military sites across the country. These chemicals are now known to be carcinogenic and can cause a range of other health problems. Heavy metal contamination is another major issue. Sites that were involved in metal plating, battery manufacturing, or painting are often heavily contaminated with chromium, lead, cadmium, and mercury. At the Rocky Mountain Arsenal near Denver, Colorado, a facility that produced chemical weapons and incendiary bombs during the war, the contamination was so severe that a large portion of the site was sealed off for decades. The waste, which included everything from nerve gas byproducts to pesticides, was dumped into unlined basins. The cleanup has been one of the largest and most complex in U.S. history. The challenge with these sites is that the pollution is often hidden. A piece of land can look perfectly normal on the surface. It might be a suburban neighborhood, a shopping mall, or a park. But meters below the surface, there can be a plume of toxic chemicals slowly spreading through the aquifer. The legacy of these production sites is a chemical mortgage that was taken out in the 1940s, and we are still paying the price today, often in places where people live and work, completely unaware of the history buried beneath their feet. How many former wartime industrial sites have been redeveloped without any proper investigation of the contamination lurking below? What are the long-term health impacts on communities that have been unknowingly drinking water contaminated with low levels of industrial solvents for decades? Is it fair for today's taxpayers to bear the multi-billion-dollar cost of cleaning up the pollution created by private companies for a national emergency 80 years ago? And what new and forgotten forever chemicals from that era are still present in the soil, their properties and dangers completely unknown to modern science. Number two were the seeds of a silent spring planted in wartime labs. While DDT became the infamous poster child for the environmental damage caused by pesticides, the chemical revolution that began during the war went much deeper. The conflict spurred intense research into all kinds of chemical agents. This included not just insecticides, but also herbicides and defoliants. The military was interested in chemicals that could clear vegetation around airfields and bases, or even be used to destroy enemy crops. This research laid the groundwork for the massive post-war boom in the herbicide industry. One of the most famous and consequential products to come out of this line of research was 2,4-D, a selective herbicide that kills broadleaf weeds, but not grasses. It was developed in the early 1940s as part of a secret wartime research program in both the UK and the US. While it was never used on a large scale during the war, its potential was immediately recognized. After the war, 2,4-D and other similar herbicides were commercialized and became a cornerstone of modern industrial agriculture. They allowed farmers to control weeds in vast fields of corn and wheat, dramatically increasing yields and reducing the need for manual labor. This, along with synthetic fertilizers, the production of which was also ramped up for munitions manufacturing, transformed farming. It allowed for the creation of the massive monocultures that dominate our agricultural landscape today. But this transformation had an ecological cost. The widespread use of herbicides eliminated many of the native plants that grew in and around farmland. This had a cascading effect on the ecosystem. The insects that relied on those plants for food disappeared. The birds that ate those insects also disappeared. The silent spring that Rachel Carson wrote about was not just caused by insecticides killing birds directly, it was also caused by herbicides destroying the base of the food web. The development of these powerful chemicals also fostered a new mindset, the idea that nature could and should be controlled through chemistry. If there was a pest, there was a chemical to kill it. If there was a weed, there was a chemical to kill it. This led to a chemical arms race in agriculture. Pests and weeds would develop resistance, requiring new and more powerful chemicals to be developed. This cycle, which began with the research priorities of the Second World War, continues to this day. The long-term effects of saturating our farmland with these chemicals for decades are still not fully understood. They can run off into rivers, affecting aquatic life. They can persist in the soil, and there are ongoing debates about their potential health effects on humans. The legacy is not just in the fields. The chemical solvents mentioned earlier, like TCE, were miracle products of their time. They could clean metal to a perfect grease-free state, which was essential for high-precision manufacturing. But their toxicity was not well understood. The casual and widespread use of these chemicals at military and industrial sites created a groundwater contamination problem that is vast in scale and incredibly difficult to fix. The miracle cleaner of the 1940s has become the toxic legacy of the 21st century, a silent and invisible threat moving beneath our feet. The war accelerated our ability to create powerful new molecules, but it did not give us a corresponding understanding of their long-term consequences. We deployed them quickly to solve immediate problems, and in doing so, we planted the seeds of slow-moving environmental crises that would take decades to even recognize. How much of the decline in pollinator populations like bees and butterflies can be traced back to the agricultural system created by wartime chemical innovations? What are the subtle, long-term ecological effects of simplifying our landscapes into vast monocultures, a process enabled by herbicides? Are there hotspots of herbicide contamination from early, poorly regulated research and production facilities that we have completely forgotten about? And have we truly escaped the chemical solution mindset that was so prevalent during the war? Or are we just using more sophisticated versions of the same approach? Number one, what happens when you leave an atomic shadow on the land? The most profound and terrifying environmental legacy of the Second World War is the one that began in secret in the deserts of New Mexico and the remote landscapes of Washington and Tennessee. The Manhattan Project, the massive effort to build the first atomic bombs, was not just a scientific endeavor, it was the largest industrial project ever undertaken. And it created a new kind of pollution, one that is invisible, odorless, and can remain dangerous for hundreds of thousands of years: radioactive waste. The production of the fissile materials for the bombs, sea plutonium, and highly enriched uranium was an incredibly dirty and inefficient process. For every gram of plutonium produced, a huge amount of radioactive and chemical waste was generated. At the Hanford site in Washington state, which was built to produce plutonium, the scale of the problem is almost beyond comprehension. Over its decades of operation, starting during the war, Hanford produced millions of tons of radioactive waste. Much of the most dangerous liquid waste, 56 million gallons of it, was stored in 177 massive underground tanks. These tanks were a temporary solution, built in a hurry. They are now old, and many of them are leaking. It's estimated that over 1 million gallons of this high-level radioactive waste, a witch's brew of cesium-137, strontium-90, and other deadly isotopes, has already leaked into the soil. From there, it is slowly migrating toward the Columbia River, the largest river in the Pacific Northwest. The cleanup of Hanford is the largest and most expensive environmental remediation project in the world. The current estimate for the cost is over $100 billion, and it will take decades, if not centuries, to complete. No one is entirely sure if it's even possible to fully clean it up. Hanford is not the only site. The Oak Ridge Reservation in Tennessee, which was built to enrich uranium, has its own legacy of massive mercury contamination and radioactive pollution. The Los Alamos National Laboratory in New Mexico, where the bombs were designed, is contaminated with plutonium, tritium, and other radioactive materials. These sites, created for a single, urgent purpose, have become permanent national sacrifice zones. The pollution they contain is so dangerous and long-lasting that it defies our normal human timescale. Plutonium-239, the primary ingredient in one of the first bombs, has a half-life of 24,100 years. This means it will take that long for its radioactivity to decrease by half. It will remain dangerous to humans and the environment for 10 times that long, 250,000 years. We have created a poison that will outlast any monument, any nation, any language we currently speak. The legacy is not just the waste from production, it's the fallout from the testing of these weapons, which began in 1945 and continued for decades. It's the contamination of entire atolls in the Pacific, like Bikini and Inuiatak, which were used as test sites and remain uninhabitable. It's the uranium mines, often on indigenous lands, that were opened to fuel the arms race and left behind a legacy of radioactive tailings and sickness. The war didn't just end with the use of these weapons, it began an entirely new and perilous chapter in human history. It introduced a force into the world that we still do not fully know how to control, and a type of pollution for which we have no true solution. It left a shadow on the land, a permanent and terrifying scar that challenges the very idea of a clean and safe future. How do you warn future civilizations 20,000 years from now not to dig at a place like Hanford? What happens to the ecosystems around these contaminated sites as the radioactive materials inevitably continue to leak and spread? Is it morally defensible to have created a problem that will be a burden and a danger to hundreds of generations of our descendants? And after seeing the permanent, unsolvable nature of this atomic scar, can we ever truly justify the creation of such materials again?